Now, a few weeks ago, Creality finally released the source code for the Ender 5 Plus. Now, this is something that many of us had been waiting for some time so that we could make a few minor tweaks to the firmware so that the printer worked a little bit more like it was supposed to. So in this video, I'm going to show you the minor modifications that I'm making to that firmware, and I'm going to make those binaries and source code available to you so that you can update this printer to fix a few nagging issues. And I'm going to talk about it right here today on Kersey Fabrications. Let's go. Jumping right into this, I wanted to explain to you what my methodology for this was, what this firmware is meant to do, and what it's not meant to do. So first of all, this source code release from Creality was for their default mainboard or for their silent board of the Ender 5 Plus, and that's because they both use the same firmware. So what did I want to do with this? Well, first of all, it's important to keep the functionality of the existing printer, to minimize the testing time, and to hopefully provide just a few fixes without any major changes to the printer. Now, this is obviously targeted at those that are happy with the default mainboard or with the silent board, that don't want to make a lot of hardware changes, and in particular don't even necessarily want to have to learn or worry about compiling their own Marlin firmware. So in this release, what I was going for was one primary fix, and that primary fix was fixing the auto bed leveling, which did not account for the distance between the BLtouch and the print head. And because of that, you don't always end up with a bed leveling mesh that prints exactly the way it's supposed to. Now, I wanted one other major fix in here, and that was the bed cooling down when it had a filament run out, but unfortunately I did find out that that function is part of the display, and so this firmware release did not solve that problem for me. Now, beyond the mesh fix, I was able to add two other features to this. So first of all, I was also able to add a probe accuracy test, which is an M48 command. I'll show you that in a few minutes. And what that allows you to do is test the accuracy of your BLtouch to make sure that it's working correctly. The other feature that I added was the linear advance function in Marlin. Now, I'm not going to cover how linear advance works or even what it does in this video, but I want you to know it's in there, and I will provide the links to learning about linear advance. You'll find them in the description. That will take you to Marlin's page and maybe even to another video from another YouTuber that will be able to help get you started with linear advance. So this will be a minor patch really, and so next up, let's go ahead and take a look at the printer. We'll take a look at how you tell which firmware that you're already running, and then I will run through real quick how you do the firmware upgrade, and most importantly, where you're going to get my new firmware from. But before we go any further, I wanted to warn you that flashing the firmware on your 3D printer could potentially leave you with a printer that doesn't boot correctly and has to be recovered. Now, obviously, me and this channel can hold no liability for anything like that that happens, and I'm going to give you all the best information I can to help avoid that. But if that happens, the responsibility is on you to figure out how to recover it, and if you're okay with that, let's move forward. So here's the display on the Ender 5 Plus. To find out which version of firmware you're currently running, just go to the Settings menu and hit Printer Info. As you can see, this is the current version of firmware that Creality has released. It's version 1.70.1 BL. Now when we go to upgrade this, you're going to see this version change because it's been changed in the firmware itself. So let's take a look at what we're trying to fix here by fixing the Z offset. So I'm going to go to the leveling menu on the printer, and it's going to auto home. And obviously it goes to the maximum X extent. Now it's going to go to the maximum Y extent. And then as it goes to the center, notice what's centered. Now the probe here is measuring how far we're off the bed, but our nozzle's what's actually in the center. So even though the printer believes that it's measuring the center of the bed, it's actually not. It's measuring the center offset by this far. So that's not correct. A correct version of bed leveling will put this where the head is, and then internally know that there is a difference here in the X and Y direction. So this is what we need to fix by changing out the firmware. this X and Y is not something that is user settable in version 1.16 of Marlin firmware. Now before we go any further, we're going to need to hook our Ender 5 Plus up to our 3D printer. So I've got a mini USB connector on this end. I'm going to hook up to the printer. Now you can obviously use the one that came with your printer. I like this one because it's longer. And then I can hook up the other end to our PC so that we can talk to our printer. Now this is going to allow us to get our settings and will allow us to actually flash that firmware. So now let's head over to the computer to show you how it's done. Okay, so before we go any further with actually flashing the firmware, let's start off with our Pronterface, which I've discussed in another video, and show you how we can save our settings. So I'm going to load up Pronterface here. Now, you should only have the drop-down ports for, hopefully, the printer that you have connected unless you have other COM port devices on here. So mine's COM4. I'm going to select the baud rate of 115/200, and I'm going to hit Connect. Now the first thing you'll notice is it dumps out all of our settings of our printer directly to the console. And this is what we need to save off in case we need any of these settings later. Now my recommendation is just open up a copy of Notepad or your favorite text editor, and then we're just going to cut and paste everything from, I don't know, you can start with the Marlin line all the way down to the bottom, Control C, Control V, and then you can save this file. Now in this file, let's look at what may be important. Notice that I've gone here and done some tuning to my printer. So this M92 command, for example, has my steps per unit. So these are slight adjustments to my steps per millimeter on my printer, which takes me to 79.48, and my calibrated extruder, which on my machine is 99.52. I also have the very much important Z probe offset, which on my printer is -2.1. Obviously, this is going to be different on your machine depending on how your hot end is put together and what modifications you've made. But save all this off in case when we update it, we need to reapply these settings. Now, when we're done with that, we can simply shut down Pronterface because we're done with that. Now let's talk about where we can get the new firmware changes that I've made. So what we're going to want to do is go into our web browser. You can get to all of my source code that I publish publicly on the github.com/Kersey Fabrications with a capital K, capital F. And right here we have our Marlin E5P for Ender 5 Plus, of course. I click here. Now you can see that I have 3 hex files here as well as all of the Marlin source in this directory. These hex files represent this being the last release that Creality released, which is the 1.70.1 BL release. And then I have 2 versions of my firmware that are available, both the 1.71.0 KF for Kersey Fabrications. And then I also have another one, which is the same version number, but I've called it HMG3. And that is for the HeroMe Gen 3. And that's because the offsets that you need for the stock hot end and for the HeroMe Gen 3 hot end are different. And so if you're running a HeroMe Gen 3, you're going to download this hex file. If you're running the stock hot end without any modifications, you're going to need this file. Now, what I can do at this point is I can clone the entire repo or just download a zip of this repo right here. And when that comes up, I will just download it to my downloads directory and click save. And there we have that entire tree downloaded to our computer. Now, if you don't want to go to the trouble of actually downloading the entire tree, including all of the source code, I will also include links in the description that will take you directly to these hex files located on my Google Drive. That might save you a little bit of time. So after I've downloaded that zip file, then I'm of course going to need to unzip it if that's the route I took. I'm going to say show in folder. That's going to have my downloads. I've downloaded this twice, as you can see, but I'm just going to go ahead and unzip this right here. I'm going to say extract. I'm going to call it whatever directory I want. Then I'm going to need to load up Creality slicer to actually do the firmware flashing. Now, I found on Windows 10, I actually have to run this as administrator to get the proper access to do this. So I'm going to say run as administrator, say yes. And now to be sure that my Creality slicer is actually talking to the right COM port, I'm going to go to machine settings. Right here, I have the serial port. It did default to COM4. You could also use auto. I like to be very specific to make sure it does what it's supposed to. So I say COM4. Make sure 115200 is the baud rate, and I'm going to say OK. At that point, I can go Machine, Install Custom Firmware, and then I can pick whichever new hex file is correct for my printer. So again, if I'm running the default Hotend configuration, I'm going to choose just the 71.0 KF. If I'm running the HeroMe Gen 3 like I am on my printer, I'm going to run the 71.0 KF HMG3.hex, and I'm going to say open. At this point, it's going to warn us that this can only be used for ATmega 2560 base boards, which this one is, and I'm going to say OK. At that point, it's going to connect, and it's going to begin uploading the firmware. This should only take a minute, and you're going to want to make sure that this bar makes it all the way down to the end before you move forward. So as you can see, it says done. It says that it installed this hex file correctly. We're going to say OK. Now once we flash our firmware, we can use the settings that we saved off before to make sure that the settings in the new firmware are still correct. So let's open up Pronterface. That pops up just as before, and let's go connect. And here we go. These are the settings like it printed out before. Now notice if we compare our text file to what Pronterface is showing us, we can see things like our M92, which is our steps per unit, are still correct. And the most important here, the Z probe offset, is also still correct. Now let's just say for the sake of demonstration that our M851 had been reset for some reason. To correct that, all we need to do is go to our text file. We can copy it, paste it into Pronterface, and hit enter. Now that's going to reset that offset to what it should be. Then we can simply type M500 to save that settings back, and that setting has been corrected. Now if you see any other settings that are wrong that you would like to tweak, you can do that while you're in here. Just make sure you hit M500 to save them back. So just as we did before, let's take a look at the settings, printer info, and there we go. As you can see, we're running our new Kersey Fabrications based software, which is 1.71.0 KF HMG3, again for the HeroMe Gen 3. Obviously, if you are running the stock, you won't have that HMG3 on the end. So let's go up top. Let's take a look at our homing sequence, see if we get that offset as we were expecting. So this is where we left it last time. Let's go to the leveling screen, see what it looks like. Leveling, it's going to home. And if all goes to plan, now the probe will be in the center of the bed, not the hot end. And that's what we're getting here. The probe is now the center, and the software knows that the hot end is an offset. Now we can go through our bed leveling sequence and verify this even further by making sure that when the probe comes to either side of the bed, it should be equidistant from each side of the bed and look correct in terms of a square mesh equally divided. So let's do that now. I'm going to hit the measuring button. So notice we are about this far from this side, a couple of inches. Now as we go to this side, again, the probe is a couple of inches from this side as well. Now what this does is it's going to make sure that the bed is leveled according to where the hot end is going to be, and that the mesh that it's generating should be correct for where we're actually printing, not 50 millimeters from where we're printing. Now notice when this goes to the center of the bed, at this point the nozzle is at the center of the bed and not the probe. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, I wanted to show you what the M48 probe accuracy test is and how to use it. So this test is designed to check the accuracy of your bed probe. So in this case, it's our BLtouch. And this is the Marlin page that describes some of the options available for this test. So how do you use it? I'm going to show you step by step. Let's go back into Pronterface. Go ahead and connect to the printer. And once we're connected, this is a pretty easy test to run. So all we have to do is first home the printer with the G28 command. Once the printer's home, we're going to type M48 and then give it a number of times we want it to probe. So we'll go with 10. So P10. And then if we pass it a V2, this is the verbosity level. And a V2 means that we'll get a little bit more information while it's doing the probing. So it does a first probe just to get a feel for where the bed is. Then the next probe will be the actual first test. And there we go. We get a 1 of 10, and our offset is negative 0.001. So the 10 probes are done. It's showing the mean is this number, so that's our average, which is 3.5 thousandths, 3.5 thousandths of a millimeter. Our min was 5 thousandths. Our max was 1 thousandth, and our range was 0.004 thousandths. So the standard deviation on this test is about 1 thousandth of a millimeter. That's extremely accurate for a bed probe, so we can be confident moving forward that our bed probe results are going to be accurate. Now, I hope this process was really easy and you're able to get your printer flashed to this new version of software. I also hope that it fixes your bed leveling issues you may have been having with your Ender 5 Plus. Now, if you want to know more about the source code changes that I made to this printer, check in the description. It's only a few lines of code I changed. I'll leave the information there. Keep in mind that this is an old version of Marlin and you'll have to use the Arduino IDE to edit this source code because it doesn't have the necessary files to use something like VS Code easily. Now, if you want to go even deeper into this and make even further changes into this firmware, I'm going to leave you with 2 projects that you can use as an alternative to what I provided. First of all, there's a project from Insanity Automation in conjunction with Tiny Machines 3D. Now, in that firmware, they have new software, new firmware. They also have new software for the touchscreen that adds a bunch of features. Now, this one, obviously, it's more in-depth, it's more configuration than what I did here, but if you want to follow the link that I'm going to put right here, as well in the description, you can walk through that and make further changes to this printer that may even fix more issues, as well as give you a newer version of Marlin. The other alternative, if you're willing to switch out the display on the printer for a more standard character-based display, you can go check out TH3D and do their mod. And with their mod, you're going to get a new display and then put new firmware on the board to use that display. I'll include a link down in the description below for that. Now, those are 2 more advanced options for people that are willing to do a little bit more tinkering with the hardware or the firmware. Now, with all that being said, I still have one big mod for you on this printer. I'm going to be switching out the main boards. I'm going to test out 2 options from Big Tree Tech. I'm going to have the SKR 1.4 Turbo. I'm also going to have the SKR Mini E3. We're going to look at both of those main boards, check out the pros and cons, and then see how they work in the Ender 5 Plus. Along with that, we're going to be swapping out the display for one of their options. It's going to give you both a character type display as well as a touchscreen. So I have that coming right around the corner. So if you've enjoyed this content, as usual, you can show your appreciation by hitting the like button. Obviously, if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe and get notifications with the little bell icon. And if you want to help contribute to the channel, the usual Patreon option is by far the easiest choice. So I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for joining me here again on Kersey Fabrications. See you next time.